Welcome to the Fierce Kind Mama of Multiples podcast. This podcast is for anyone expecting or currently raising multiples, twins, triplets, or more. I speak to inspiring parents of multiples who have healed from unexpected pregnancies and birthing experiences and who candidly share the highs and lows of raising multiples. I also speak to the professionals that work with multiple birth families. Together, we cover the practicalities of raising more than one baby at a time, as well as enhancing the emotional well-being of caregivers and children alike. Come join us as we laugh, cry, and share our personal and professional wisdom on all things multiples. I am your host, Dr. Christina Kvetsa, and I am a fierce kind mama of multiples. On today's episode, I'm joined by Professor Pat Preedy. Pat has had a long and distinguished career in education, including being a global chief academic officer, executive principal, and head teacher in the UK. Pat completed her Master of Education, particularly investigating how schools can work in partnership with parents. And she has a doctorate in education, which focused on meeting the educational needs of multiple birth children. She's the honorary research consultant for Twins Trust in the UK and a board member for the International Council of Multiple Births. On today's episode, she shares with us the main findings of her research and offers parents and educators useful advice on understanding multiples' educational needs. I hope you enjoy this episode. So I'd love to welcome on today's episode Dr. Pat Preedy. Welcome, Pat. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you.
Please share a bit about yourself and your professional background and how you came to study the educational needs of multiple birth children.
Well, I have been in education all of my life, actually, as a child and then as a teacher, going on to be a deputy. I was head of 3 schools, and I'm still in education, doing research, which has gone alongside my work, and also supporting the Twins Trust in the UK and ICOMBO, the International Society for Twin Studies and Families of Multiple Births. So it might seem odd. How did I become involved in research with multiples? Well, actually, it was way back in 1992, and I think there's still photographs somewhere on the internet there. I was the head of quite a small school in what we call the Midlands, quite rural. We were looking down the new children's starting school, myself and the secretary, and we said, oh, that's odd, a set of twins. A set of twins, a set of twins. And there were 9 sets of twins starting at the same time. So it just so happened that what was then called TAMBA, now Twins Trust, the Twins and Multiple Births Association, were doing a talk in my area. And I have to say it was because there were 9 sets I went along. Now I realise if there'd been 1 set, I should have gone along and been interested. But, serendipity. And I went and met people like yourself, parents of twins, people who'd set up the organisation, Judy Linney, who was very much in healthcare. And I was really ashamed to say, learned lots about twins and the families and multiples and their needs that I simply didn't know. And they spoke about David Hay, who later became a friend and colleague. And the only research there was in Australia. And I had finished my master's and thought, that's it, I'm not going to do any more research. And the discussion arose about how about doing some research, as you've got this lovely group in your school and you've got the connections with the university and so on. And that's what led actually to what is the equivalent of a lifetime involvement with twins and multiple births. And like everything, if you research deeply in one area, there is a positive knock-on to absolutely everything else. So that's my twin story. That's how I got started.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that. So you became really fascinated then by what you were hearing from the families themselves.
Absolutely. And, issues like separation, issues how they start school, when they get older, how they feel about themselves. To be quite honest, as a teacher, I have not given that really a thought, other than, if I'm honest, thinking, well, it's probably best to separate them when they start school and moving on quickly. So it was a whole area to really find out about children, their development and their families' needs.
Yeah, and you mentioned that at the time, Professor David Hay from Australia was conducting much of the research on the educational needs of multiple birth children. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what that research revealed and how it influenced your own progression into this research area.
Well, it was very interesting from my perspective because he was a psychologist. He was very much interested, in the families and the development of the children. And at the time, and this is still can be an issue, the research with multiples was very much about using them as a sample, for genetic research, to see about illnesses and so on, all important work, but somehow forgetting about the needs of the children and the families themselves. So that was the first thing. He was very much about children, and my life is very much about children. So we immediately connected there. He's a really good quantitative researcher. He's very, because he's a professor in the university, he'd got the methodology. We needed reliable information. So you could go to his research, and he had done all that work on validity and reliability. And he had done a really big survey in Australia. And it was very, very interesting. One of the key things was that twins and multiple births, and I have to be careful here, can have an issue where they come in below singletons in terms of their speech and language developments. That is very much to do with them being more than one of them, getting less eye contact, less one-to-one conversation, perhaps being left, alone to, just chatter together rather than engaging with the adult. That was a big finding. And then almost the set policy of separating children when they started school. And he found that. And in fact, there was an outcome from that research that said the best policy is no policy, to be flexible. Later, when I did my research, I changed that a little bit and said the best policy is to have a policy that understands multiples and that you say how you're going to manage them within the school.
So I understood that you also undertook the first national survey of schools in England in 1994 that interviewed multiples and their parents. And I'm really curious as to what the main findings of that research were.
Yes, well, liaise with David so that we could learn the lessons from the Australian research in designing the survey, which was to go out to schools. I had massive support from the Twins and Multiple Births Association because in those days we weren't able to distribute things electronically like we are these days. And my director of education in Solihull, Chris Trinick, was incredibly supportive of any research, and particularly my research. And he arranged to contact all of the local authorities in England so that we could send the surveys to the local authorities, and they distributed them and collected them back. So we were able to get out to a really large number of schools, most schools actually in the country, and come back. And because it was coming from the local authorities, it gave the research then that credibility, and in itself raised a lot of interest in multiple birth children and their families in schools. So that survey was to really look at, what was happening, what did teachers think, what were their views on separate, together, how did they do anything when the children were starting school, did they take into account things like prematurity and so on. And what was interesting is that, again, the decision to separate children in school was really an arbitrary one, not based on any information about the children. and that the understanding of their development and issues to do with multiple birth children was like myself when I started out, very limited. And there was no reference to a policy. Schools might say, our policy is to separate the children, or our policy is to keep them together. But that was very much not written down anywhere, not part of a school policy. And then simultaneously, I visited children and their families at home in the area where I was, which was representative of the country. So we could say this was very typical, to discover what the experiences were of the families, particularly preschool. Now, the really strong thing that came through, and you'll appreciate this as a parent of multiples, is that the opportunities for the children to have separate experiences are incredibly limited, especially when they're little. So they are not able to develop that individuality. They're often together, even sleeping together. Very few of the children slept apart, even till quite late on. And then suddenly you're saying, oh, well, we're going to go to school now, and you're going to be in separate classes, have separate teachers, and that'll be fine because it'll be good for you to help with your identity. Whereas developing yourself and identity begins right from the start, and it's not linked to separation. It's linked to things like knowing your name, knowing who you are, and so on. When I started the research, the university tutor said to me, she said, I don't know why you're thinking of doing this at all, she said, because how can it be different to siblings? She said, there's all this research on siblings, about rivalry, dominance, dependence, and so on. Surely it's just the same for multiples. And I had to really think about it, because that's a strong argument. Actually, what this research showed is, yes, those things are there in siblings. Of course they are. But because you've got two or more children born at exactly the same time, as it were, I know there can be a gap in between, then there isn't this excuse to say, well, that person's older or that person's younger. So therefore, they themselves and other people tend to compare them much more. And so everything is the same as siblings, but often that little bit more. But the key difference, which led to the model, was to do with identity. It was the way that the children related to each other. And I can remember talking to David about that, and the university was saying, well, if you think that this is different, then you've got to produce a model, haven't you? A theoretical model. And I woke up in the middle of the night, actually, and thought of the model and came down at about 3 a.m, because it suddenly, as these things often do, came together. And it's based on Winnicott's theories about human development. And I thought, right, so on the one side, we've got closely coupled. Those children, some of them I'd visited, they're almost like two as one, often identical. There was one mom that if one child spilt something down his clothing, she changed both children so that they were always exactly the same. That idea is two as one, and that often comes through in the media. And at the extreme, you get children who don't know their own name, they don't know their mirror image, they simply operating as more than one. And there was one family I talked to, and they had two girls, and they were the most delightful family. And the children were Hina and Huma. And the dad said, oh, we mixed up the name wristbands in hospital, so we never know which is which. So we just call them both Hina Huma. Now, they were so happy, so loving, but that actually in terms of their development, when we talk to them, it's really important they know their name, know who they are, and can develop as individuals. So that's the closely coupled. On the opposite side, we've got extreme individual. There are those children who really don't like being a multiple. They fight, they don't like it. You get stories of where they've fallen out, not spoken for years, and it's really a very great challenge for them. It's a massive competition and rivalry. Interestingly enough, the children can oscillate between those two positions. And you can notice that sometimes where you get that extreme closeness and then that real fighting. Now, the middle position is called mature dependence. That's where being a multiple is not the most important thing in your life. You know who you are, you share some friends, you can do your own things, but equally, if you're comfortable and you want to do the same thing as your twin, that's absolutely fine. We all can relate to that model. Sometimes we need to be closely coupled and we need a hug and support. Sometimes we go to the other end, but mostly we're in the middle. And that helps us to think about things like school placement. If you've got children that are very closely coupled and you suddenly separate them, then you can expect to have real problems. If you've got children that are really at the extreme individuals and you put them in the same class, then equally you can have real difficulties in that class. Frankly, in the middle, if you talk to the children, and I've talked to many, it doesn't much matter. Because being a multiple is not the most important thing, so long as they've got the opportunities to be separate and to be together. So the model came out of the research to help us to think about how the children develop and operate and relate to themselves and others in a much more sophisticated way. And it helps us to think about some strategies that we might do right from the start. Like I was saying, calling them by their name, giving them some opportunities for individual play and so on, that help them to develop as an individual, as well as celebrating being a multiple, because it's a great and positive thing too.
Hi there, fierce kind mama. Are you expecting multiples and wondering how you're going to cope when the babies arrive? Or do you already have multiples at home and wonder, will this ever get easier? First of all, let me say loud and clear, I get it. Feeling overwhelmed in motherhood is really common, and us mothers of multiples are particularly prone to feeling sometimes like it's all too much. I know for myself that becoming a first-time mother to twins at the age of 40 was a huge adjustment, physically and psychologically. So I've taken my years of training in mental health and my experience coaching mothers of multiples and put together a guide with my 5 top tips for overcoming overwhelm as a multiple birth parent. This guide is free, of course, and it doesn't matter what age multiples you have. You may be pregnant, or your multiples might have already left home. The principles apply to all parents of multiples. And because I know you're short on time, I've broken down the tips into easy-to-read chunks that you can begin implementing straight away. You can get your free copy now by signing up at my website, fiercekindmama.com. Wonderful. You know, when you were speaking, I thought about, there were so many things that came up, but I know that something that did come out of your research was focusing on the school entry. And so you've developed, I believe, a questionnaire that can be completed by parents and teachers. Can you tell us a bit about that questionnaire and where it's been adopted and maybe some of the challenges in making it standard practice, if any?
Yes, it will be very difficult in schools, I have to say, to make things standard practice, particularly the way that schools work here as individuals. And it is really about persuasion. And the way to do this, I think, is through the organisations like Twins Trust, like iCombo and so on, so that schools, I know, the vast majority of schools are keen to take on good practice and want to do the best for children. So that's why it's important that they have access to these reliable instruments, because you know there's a lot out there that's not reliable in the world, especially on the internet. The questionnaire was really to help parents and the staff on school entry to focus on what it was like for the children before they started school. So how they are if they've been separated and when they're separated, what opportunities they've had for separation, their likes and dislikes. It's interesting that many schools will do a starting school questionnaire and school visits for parents. And what I have tried to do is to build on that, to put in a multiple birth extension of that so that the staff can also think about what it would be like for the children. So For example, they can play going to school and what it will be like. They can have visits and experiences where the staff take into account that there are multiple. Now, it may be that many of them just want to check up on each other. But in the early years settings, it is actually often much easier to enable the children to have experiences together and separate experiences, particularly when they work with their key persons in small groups of 3, 4, 6. The ideal would probably be where you've got those groups. One could be with their one key person, learn to make that relationship with that adult. The other one could be with the other key person in the same large room or setting. And then they've got opportunities also to learn how to engage with other children. So the questionnaire guides and helps the parents and the staff to think about that rather than just that abrupt start to school and this is how it's going to be now.
Yes. And is that available freely, like for anyone? Can people here in Australia, where I'm based, are they able to access this and use it for their purposes?
Absolutely. Through ICOMBO, through AMBER, the Australian Multiple Births Association, and on the education website that I've developed with my colleague John Maskazine, where we're still working together, all of these resources are available free to parents and to schools. And if parents sensitively go along and say to the teacher, actually, you might find this would be helpful to think about the children. We thought you might like to have that as part of a discussion. And I think, again, the vast majority of parents and teachers would welcome that opportunity. It just gives you a little bit of guidance and help in thinking about the children's start to school.
Yes, that's great. And is it also used as kind of a review, like after, say, the first year? So when they've entered school, now they're kind of in the system, if you like. Could it be something that could be used in the next year to see whether is it time to change? If, say, the multiples have gone in the same class, maybe now there's concerns. Should we use this questionnaire or can we use a questionnaire to decide whether they stay together or should be separated in the following year, as an example?
Yes, that's right, because children, especially young children, change and develop very rapidly. So flexibility is the key thing. So yes, to review where they are, what opportunities they've had, and now is the situation moved on, and also remembering to talk to the children themselves about what they would like in school. You just have to remember, if they've been in the situation where both are in a class with a teacher and perhaps assistants, and they say, oh, right, now we do want to have our own classes. That may mean them one or more of the group moving into a class where the social group isn't there, and so it's a little different. And the temptation is to say, well, if there's one more confident, we'll put that one in away from where their friends are. And the research has shown that often that's the one then that loses confidence and the other one comes up and gains in confidence. So any transition like that would have to be carefully planned. Before you start, usually in September, the start of the school year. Prior to that, I would say that if you're going to do that, you need to plan a transition where the child that's moving has the chance to integrate and develop friendship and social groups in the other class, not just suddenly move them and think, oh, they're the confident one, they'll be all right.
That's a wonderful point, because I'm not sure, obviously, the system that I'm in is in the Australian school system. My kids are in the Australian school system, and I'm not sure how much that is actually considered in terms of that transition into separate after having been together, say, and then thinking about kind of a preparatory lead up to that. I'm actually not sure what the standard is for that, but that's a really interesting point you make.
Yeah, I've done quite a lot of work on the impact of transition with young children. Right. And remember, the younger the child, the bigger that impact is going to be, and the less skills that they can draw on to cope with that. So when you're doing any sort of change, it can be in the classroom where you're moving from one activity to the other, you're changing adults, all sorts of things. For children, we need to plan that transition in and out same at the start of school, moving on, all the way through, so that you're enabled to cope with that and actually be very positive about it. And it's really easy to do if you think about it.
Yeah, lovely. What a great point. I understand also that you've identified a gap in the literature where the psychological development of multiples and their educational needs were largely being neglected. And that led to your book called Multiple Voices, where multiples themselves were given the opportunity to express their feelings on a range of issues. I was wondering what some of the concerns or opinions were that the multiples themselves expressed.
Yes, again, it's something that's sort of gone through my life, that we've always got to remember to talk to the children, to see how it is from their point of view. Very young children, we can be a play partner, get into their play, so that we're really understanding what they're thinking and how the world is for them. And then as they get older, giving them those opportunities to have those discussions with us so that we understand where they're coming from. And that started the little book that I did with Mary Lowe at the time, Multiple Voices, where the children simply wrote about what it was like for them to be a multiple. I have to say, the vast majority of comments were really, really positive. They spoke about having a special friend, about helping each other with homework, about all the things that they like to get up to, the fun that they have with their families. They sometimes spoke about how their twin annoyed them and they wanted some space, but the vast majority was positive. But the theme that came through, again, was that to do with that knowing me as an individual. They didn't like it if people didn't know their names, didn't know who they were, mix them up, call them things like twinny and so on. And so they wanted to be known for themselves, but they also wanted to be known as a multiple. That was the really important thing. And you asking me that question makes me think it's time for us to do that again. It would be good to get some more multiple voices now and hear what the children have to say. And I think I'd like to do it as well where I've got older children. It was very much what we call the primary end up to age 11. I think now it would be very interesting also to get some older students. And when we finish this conversation, I'm going to talk to my colleague, John Maskazine, and say, I think we need to do that now and put that on the website. Time for a refresh.
Oh, that's amazing. I'd love for you to come back on the show and tell us what you find, because I do think it's such an important piece to understanding multiples and hearing from them themselves and the older children, through the adolescents. I imagine there's, a lot of richness there that can be discovered in terms of their experience. Yeah, what an amazing thing that would be. I know that,
I'm definitely going to do it.
Yes. Oh, yeah, you'll have to report back to us. So multiple birth families definitely attract attention. We know that as, parents of multiples, we know when we're just going out doing our daily grocery shopping or whatever, we get stopped and asked questions. But based on your research with parents and children, how do they themselves feel about attracting attention? Have they expressed any comments about that?
Yes, I did ask the parents about it, and that was something the children said. In some ways, most of them said they actually quite liked it. That, that it was like the children that started school, there was their picture, and I know they're grown up and they've still got that original picture together. They love it because it was a celebration of them. If you cross a line, though, where that again assumes an importance where it dominates your life, to the point of view, like I was describing, where that parent went out where they were always dressed the same, it was about creating that attention. Then the children can become used to that attention. That's not linked to them as individuals or themselves. It's written about as the prima donna effect. And then when that stops, or somebody says, oh, well, I want to take a picture of the identical ones, I don't want the non-identical ones, and so on, that can affect their self-esteem. So I think we've just got to be very careful that we have a balance, have a proportionality, and always think about the development of the children. We all like a bit of fuss and attention. There's nothing wrong with that. Just being cautious that it doesn't then overstep that mark where it can cause particular damage to the self-esteem.
Yeah, I do think that's an important point to consider. And when I'm thinking about self-esteem, I also wonder about comparisons because comparisons seem hard to avoid. What do parents and educators need to know about how multiples themselves experience being compared to one another?
Yeah, we're great for doing that as humans, aren't we? We're always comparing one against the other and the positives and the negatives, and very quick to judge. And we can have a sort of, I don't know, a blind spot when it comes to multiples and think, well, there they are. And we start talking about them as though they haven't got feelings or they're not human and comparing one to the other. Now, I think a golden rule is don't compare to the detriment of one to the other. Right. So, and be careful of the labels. This is the clever one. This is always the good one. This is the one that I can rely upon to do the jobs. This is the silly one. It's easy to get into those labels and then live up to it. I can remember 2 boys starting school. I spoke to the mum, and she pulled 2 pieces of sewing out of her pocket. And she said, look at this one. And it was beautiful and all lovely stitches. And then the other, which was sort of stitches all over the place, which was much more like something I'd probably have done. And she said, look, that's typical. She said, this is what you'll find. This is the neat one, the one that always does things right. And good luck with the other one. And that's what she said. Now, actually, they were both great boys. We did separate them because we really wanted to work on the self-esteem of both, because the boy that had always been told that he got everything right was lovely needed to cope with not being able to get success and learning, and he couldn't always be the number one. And the other child needed to learn that he got lots of skills and abilities. Both of them went on to do great things. So that's just a little example of being very careful when you compare and when you label any child, but particularly multiples.
I think that's such a great example because we often, well, I imagine most people assume it's the negative labels that, we must avoid, which I agree. I think, rightfully so. But there's also the need to remember that when we're labeling even one, if it's in the multiple situation where we're labeling one, even though might be labeling them positively, it can actually be causing harm in a way too. That's a really good example of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of the comparison with the one that's actually not being labeled as in the positive terms.
Yeah, and that we're just learning about multiples then helps us to also understand other children and everyone better. As I would say, that knowledge that we have there then deepens our knowledge about children and humanity in general, and ourselves too.
Yes, yeah. I think the reality is most of us will never really know what it's like to be a multiple. And I imagine that there are many factors that influence the relationship between multiples. But I wonder, because we've been talking about the school context, I wonder about the situation where multiples might speak for one another. And what are the implications of that type of dependence, particularly in the school context?
Yes, I mean, at the extreme, you get where people describe what they call a twin language or cryptophasia, where the children have, it's really an immature language where they are almost like a little code that they have. And that's where David's work was so important in understanding the importance of the language development of babies and young children, and that children are modeling their language on adults, and we're making sure that they've got their eye contact and turn taking and so on. And there is a temptation, if they're happy playing together and reinforcing each other's sounds and language, you think, oh, that's fine, and it is fine. It's part of what children do and part of them enjoying that relationship, but you've always got to have an eye to their language development and making sure that they're getting that modeling so that they can communicate with other friends and with adults. I have had situations where one twin then speaks for the other, interprets the other. And then where is that on the model? One is very closely coupled and one is taking on the parenting role. And you can almost go along with it without even realizing, more in male-female children. And the children themselves spoke about that in multiple voices, where one said his sister always speaks for him and always says, and he wants to get his own views across. So again, if we're aware of those things, we can just do a little adjustment that then helps to both children to develop confidently.
Yes, lovely. There's so much more I know I could ask you, but I am conscious of your time. And so I'd love to end this conversation with some practical advice for parents and educators when it comes to the educational needs of their children. So if there was one main piece of advice you'd give multiple birth families, what would it be?
It would be that being a multiple is not a disability. It's a really positive, lovely thing for the children and the families, and a privilege for the school when they come along. And with just a little bit of understanding, like everything, of knowledge, you can make those small adjustments where you understand them as children, both as individual and as multiples, and you enable them then to flourish and thrive and develop and make the most of their lives. And looking back now with over, well, dare I say, 40 years, what a wonderful thing is that if we can do that for children.
Yes, absolutely. What a wonderful piece of advice for families. Thank you so much, Pat, for sharing your wisdom with us and your experience and your knowledge. I'm sure the listeners will find this episode very useful. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you've heard, then please consider subscribing and leaving a review so that other expectant and current parents of multiples like yourself can find this podcast and the valuable information it contains. I would be so very grateful if you left a review and shared this with anyone you think could benefit from listening. If you have a particular topic you'd like me to cover on this podcast, feel free to reach out to me via my website, fiercekindmama.com, or connect with me on social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as Fierce Kind Mama of Multiples. New episodes are released every fortnight, so we'll see you back here real soon. Any advice and information in this podcast is general only and has been prepared without taking into account your particular circumstances and needs. For tailored, individualized advice, please consult with a qualified professional.